Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time, we completed Bottle Grotto, which was a bit of a mixed bag, especially when accounting for the dungeon layout, which in many ways restricted how the overall navigation could be designed. This time, we're heading into Key Cavern, the game's third dungeon. But first, there's a few pre-dungeon things to discuss, far more than either of the previous two. So, let's hop right into things. Now that we have the power bracelet, a fair amount of Kanalet Island will open up to us, giving us some much needed open exploration around the prairie. There's plenty of optional little goodies and secrets for us to gather, side content to engage in, including the photo booth if you're playing the DX version, and Dampé's Dungeon Builder minigame in the Switch remake. That's something I'll come back to in a later video. That said, exploring around here is wonderfully fun. Kanalet can at times feel a bit restrictive with where you can go and what you can do, but as you get more items and open new paths and shortcuts, the island gradually feels a little less winding and twisting and a little more sprawling and open. It's a great approach that works very well for classic Zelda, furthering that item gating progression system that I've talked about already in the last two videos, which is nice. If you haven't already started into the game's trading sequence, you'll need to at this point in order to even gain access to the dungeon, since this guy Richard will task you with exploring Canalet Castle to retrieve his golden leaves. But you need monkeys to build a bridge for you. The castle is something of a mini dungeon, which is why I wanted to discuss it in a bit of detail here. If you played A Link to the Past, then the secret passageway around the back should feel pretty familiar. But once within the walls, we have a nice balance of design ideas in the castle, some open explorable space in the courtyards outside, and a linear combat gauntlet within the castle interior itself, which winds upstairs around the balcony and then up to this room where we square off against a ball and chain soldier. The castle is not a complex labyrinth, but as a sort of mini dungeon, it is a pretty enjoyable little excursion. This quest for Richard also acts in some ways like an item check, as he'll encourage you to get a shovel, which you'll need to find the slime key anyways, and the castle has some spots requiring bombs. Bombs will also be mandatory in Key Cavern as well, so the game forcing us to acquire them before we head that way is a good design choice. After that is a little challenge in the pothole field to get the dungeon key, which is fine. It satisfies my innate urge to cut grass, but something I'd like to point out is that the remake adds this tiny little shortcut here, right from where you get the slime key back to the lock that the key is used for. The original had us instead backtrack all the way through the way we came and back out Richard's villa, which is fine, but that little looping shortcut is a really nice touch from a level design standpoint, and makes the whole sequence feel a little more streamlined in a way that isn't unnatural. I appreciate it. But we're really here to talk about the dungeon itself. Once we have the slime key, yes, it's really called that, we can open this gate and head into the dungeon. Welcome to Key Cavern, the dungeon that holds the honor of containing the most small keys of any Zelda dungeon in history, with a whopping total of 9. Also, it is shaped like a key. While examining the previous 2 dungeons, I mentioned that the game trying to lay out the dungeons in specific shapes has at times held it back, like they're putting themselves in too much of a box. Not so much in Tail Cave, but in Bottle Grotto though, it was pretty noticeable. Here, it isn't actually an issue. That may be due to the key shape itself, which offers more flexibility for branching paths than Bottle Grotto did in its latter half. Plus, this is the game's first dungeon to have multiple floors, which gives the level designers even more elbow room to work with to make the navigation interesting. The dungeon consistently gives you options of where to go, with lots of little dead ends and obstacles in place that you will need to mentally take note of and then return to with the dungeon item. And the use of keys here is comparable to some of the series' best dungeons, like Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple, which similarly had lots of locked doors, lots of open explorable space where we could find keys, and then a critical path that requires you to spend several small keys in a row to get through. It's not quite on the same scale here. Obviously, Key Cavern is much smaller than the Forest Temple, but it is that same design formula, and there's some inherent satisfaction to scouring this place, gathering keys, and then blasting through these locks. But let's back up a bit here and talk about the music. A commonality between the dungeon themes so far has been that alternation between danger and curiosity, which Key Cavern's theme does as well. In fact, Key Cavern has one of the more dramatic dungeon themes, certainly, but it is a bit on the weaker side for me. There's two main parts to it. The first one that alternates between these big bold phrases and more understated sections. And the second one, which feels a bit more inquisitive. They did a great job translating this piece for the remake, adding some really great flair to it. And leading into this almost off-kilter feel with the piano and synth choices. I would say that the original version of this song is just not the most memorable dungeon theme. There's nothing bad about it, but nothing that hooks me either. It does the job well enough though. The updated version for the remake, however, is a big improvement. The choices of instrumentation really elevates the piece for me, adding a great sense of unease, as it should. In terms of progression, the dungeon overall can be pretty neatly divided into two sections as well. The first section would be the shaft of the key, so to speak, which is a mostly linear section of halls, but still contains a handful of side rooms to check out, consistently providing us with either options of where to explore or teases of places we'll be able to get to later. This first section ends in this room downstairs, where the dungeon really lets go of your hand. There's 4 locked doors to choose from, and you'll only have a single key when you get here. The choice is really yours on which door to take, though that tension is somewhat artificial. Each room will replace the key you spent to get there. However, there is an extra safety key you can get right before the boss fight, but we'll come back to that. Anyways, the second section starts back upstairs, and this is where I would say the dungeon is at its best. There's a ton of explorable space, with just the right amount of obstacles and paths being locked. Between my 2 treks through this dungeon, I was able to tackle the rooms in this section in 2 completely different orders, which was awesome to do. In a way, this section could be considered the dungeon's central room, though it is somewhat segmented and deeper into the dungeon than most of its contemporaries. But in terms of how the different rooms of this section branch off from here, it is the closest thing this dungeon has. It's here that we'll find the dungeon's mid-boss, the Dodongo snakes. These guys are neat, though they're pretty passive as far as enemies go. You have to force feed them bombs until they quite literally explode, and that's about it. Though I'll never not be amused by the way they sometimes shake their heads to refuse a bomb snack. After defeating them, we'll find the dungeon item, the Pegasus boots, which return from A Link to the Past, giving us a little running dash ability. utility. Now, I'm sure you saw this talking point coming, but your experience here with this item will differ depending on which version you're playing due to the inventory management differences. In the original, it is treated as an equipable item just like everything else, which means you'll have to toggle it on and off from the menu when you need to use it. And that includes an instance where you need to use it in conjunction with the Roc's Feather to take a running jump over this gap, so you're going to have to put your sword away completely. I complained about the item management issue at length when talking about the power bracelet in Bottle Grotto, so I apologize for the redundancy, but hear me out. That item swapping only gets worse the more items you get. The dungeon makes use of many items, including your sword, bombs, the Roc's Feather, and Pegasus boots, though bombs and the boots get the most utility here, so it isn't quite as bad here as it could be. But it is still an issue. The Switch remake permanently maps the boots to your L button, so you never have to bother equipping and unequipping them, and thank goodness for that. It's great to be able to dash at any time without having to fiddle around in menus first. Plus, he makes this cute little pitter-patter sound with his feet when winding up for a dash. I love that. And for everyone reminding me that this was a hardware limitation of the Game Boy, I am well aware of that. Though with the power bracelet, it was an easier complaint to make. The bracelet could have been auto-equipped and treated as a context-sensitive input, the same way that actions like opening chests or talking to NPCs make use of the A button as a context-sensitive action button. Treating it that way could remove the need to ever have to put it on or take it off. But in the case of the Pegasus boots, I'm not quite as sure about how they could have worked around it. It needs a dedicated input. Maybe double tapping on the D-pad direction you're moving could have worked, or something to that effect, similar to how you get into a sprint in Smash Bros. But that's the best proposal I've got. Either way, I'm glad to see this fixed in the remake. Again, I know it was a technical limitation of the Game Boy, which quite literally didn't have more buttons to work with, but that doesn't make it any less irritating to swap items constantly, and it also doesn't change the fact that the devs knew about this when making the game, and could have better designed their item systems to work within the confines of the hardware it was being created for. This is the last time I'll complain about this issue over the course of covering this game, otherwise these videos will get very repetitive. So just know that the item swapping will continue to be an issue for the rest of the game in the DX version, and it's something you'll either have to learn to look past, or consider just getting the Switch remake if you can't. I wanted to also quickly mention that right before getting the item, there's this neat little push block puzzle. It's a very simple puzzle, but what I like about it is that it subtly blocks the way out behind you, giving you a small point of no return. So when you get the Pegasus boots, you're forced to use them in order to give yourself an exit. It's that same great sort of new item tutorialization that I mentioned way back in my Great Deku Tree video with the slingshot, locking you into this small space and making you use the item to get out. Anyways, with our newly acquired Pegasus boots, there's no section of the dungeon off limits anymore, as the boots allow us to destroy these weird things. I cannot find the name of them for the life of me, so I'm just gonna call them balloon rocks. We can use the boots to complete puzzles that we passed by earlier, to easily defeat enemies that were challenging to fight without them, as well as destroy balloon rocks to access new areas, and even combine them with the jumping power of the Roc's Feather to get the boss key. The Pegasus boots are a great item overall. I'm happy to see them make a return. There's also a few neat little environmental puzzles that teach you about using bombs effectively. We should know already by now that you can bomb cracked walls, but it's taken a step further here, teaching us that some walls may be destructible without having that visual tell, or sometimes that you can only see the cracks on one side, with either side being bombable. Case in point, this wall has a big arrow to point us towards it. This wall appears cracked from this side, but creates a shortcut back to the central room, and we can figure out that this wall is bombable because this balcony provides a preview of the room on the other side, showing us those cracks in the wall. It's a great way of using the environment to teach us things. And while the owl statue here does hint towards it somewhat, the hint it actually gives us is just that poking bombable walls with our sword produces a different sound. I love that kind of hint, because it's not just telling us to bomb that specific wall, but rather telling us how to figure out for ourselves which walls are destructible and which ones are not. That's how it should be done. Don't just give me the solution to a puzzle, but instead the tools to figure it out for myself. Alright, with all of that said and done, once we've smacked this guy out of the way, we can confront the dungeon boss. When we enter the boss room, the boss is initially nowhere to be found, only a voice taunting us, though little voles will drop from the ceiling as a hint, so we can use our newly acquired Pegasus boots to charge the wall and knock the boss from the ceiling. This is the Slime Eye, and he is perhaps the easiest boss in the game. But first, let's look at his visual design. In the DX version, he's got this very nice transparent effect, while the Switch remake swaps that out for an opaque, reflective, shiny surface. Both look good. It's neat getting the 360 of the room reflected like that, but I think the blue transparent look of the original might be a little bit cooler. Not sure why they opted for a dull gray in the remake. That said, he is basically a big eyeball monster, and if you've been keeping up with this series through all of the games I've covered already, then you'll know how I feel about that. It's frankly overdone. Thankfully, he is the only giant eyeball boss in this game, unlike A Link to the Past, which had 3. So it is pretty forgivable. But what I don't like about Slime Eye is how absurdly easy he is to defeat. You stab his eye a bunch so that he begins to undergo mitosis, then dash at his stretched out midsection with the boots to break him apart, and then just go ham on him with your sword until he dies. I guess the challenge lies in trying to figure out how to defeat him to begin with, which is fine, but then once you know, he's absolutely trivial to take down, and that undercuts the value of the fight on repeat playthroughs. Because if you come in armed with that knowledge, there's no challenge left. I like when puzzle elements bleed into my boss battles, but I would have liked to have had a little bit of both puzzle and combat challenge, not just one or the other. Alas, Slime Eye will go down very quickly. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, and we'll find the Sea Lily's Bell, the third instrument of the siren needed to awaken the windfish. Overall, Key Cavern is a more than competent dungeon. Its structure is spot on, and it has a lot of great puzzles that require the player to pay attention to the environment and make mental notes of things to come back to after getting the dungeon item. That's great. There's lots of explorable space and branching paths with dead ends and keys galore, though there are a few missed opportunities that could have elevated this dungeon from a good one to an excellent one. For one, the dungeon has a bunch of conveyor belts that act as both obstacles and even a puzzle wrinkle to the combat in some rooms. That's cool, but it would have been cool to have used it in conjunction with the Pegasus boots. Perhaps having an extra fast conveyor belt somewhere in the dungeon as an item gate that we can only get past by dashing with the boots, or something to that effect. I do like that the Parod enemies are almost a puzzle to defeat in and of themselves, and then become a non-issue once you have the Pegasus boots. That is a great way of both making your dungeon item useful and giving the player a sense of becoming more powerful. And enemies that you have to approach strategically instead of just brute forcing through are always welcome. That's cool. I also am not a huge fan of where the map and compass are placed within the dungeon. It isn't the worst thing in the world, but I would have made the map obtainable a little sooner without the need to backtrack for it. The compass, meanwhile, is found in the deepest reaches of the dungeon, and aside from the small key in the next room, is probably the last thing you'll find before heading towards the boss fight. In essence, they're both found too late into the dungeon to truly be useful, because by the time you have them both, you've probably explored everywhere and mapped out the majority of the dungeon already. I suppose you could view it as a last-minute failsafe to make sure you can double-check if you've missed anything, but for me, finding it right at the end of the dungeon makes its inclusion feel more like a formality than something that is actually useful. Again, not the biggest deal since the rest of the dungeon is more than good enough to make up for it, but still worth a mention. Another very minor note, but when talking about Tail Cave, I mentioned how the remake adds seamless scrolling to larger rooms, so it is a bit odd to me that they only half do that here. This whole section of the dungeon is really one larger interconnected area, and some parts of it get the seamless scrolling treatment, while others still stick to the screen transitions. I don't really mind it too much. It may have been done to make sure the camera doesn't pan to things that they don't want you to see yet, but when going through this little corridor, it gets pretty jarring. And my final note is about keys. There is actually one more key than there is a locked door within the dungeon. That last one will drop right here in this room, right before the boss fight. That extra key actually confused me at first, but I think it is meant to be a failsafe for this section of the dungeon where you find 4 locked doors and you only have a single key. If you leave that right side room for last, then you won't need it. But if you didn't do that, then you'll have a chance to go explore those rooms that you missed out on. Since each of those 3 rooms replenishes the key spent to enter it, the math still works out that you'll always have an extra key if you explore every room. But I get the idea here, as players could potentially be locked out of ever seeing one of those rooms otherwise, even if they aren't critical to progression. That note isn't really a complaint, just a funny little quirk of the dungeon. Otherwise, Cavern is a very good dungeon, and while it has a few very minor flaws, it lays down the groundwork that some of this series' all-time best dungeons would follow, and puts the excellent lock and key system to use. I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, Stefan, Avery, and all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.